If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? This is a famous philosophical thought experiment that questions the connection between reality and our senses. We could try to reformulate the same question in a more radical way. If there is a tree in a desert and no one can perceive it through our senses, does the tree exist? The philosopher and theologist George Berkeley is often associated with this problem because he famously identifies his whole philosophy through three simple words: esse, est, percipi. It's a Latin expression that literally means being is perceiving, or to be is to be perceived. He's considered one of the most radical idealists in the whole history. It's extremely difficult to challenge his arguments. Many thinkers attempt to refute Berkeley's radical idealism, but one particularly stands proudly among the others: Immanuel Kant. In this video, we will first try to understand how Berkeley very meticulously destroys reality with his strong argumentations, and then we will see the one and only possible solution offered by Immanuel Kant. In January 1782, Kant read the first reviews of the Critique of Pure Reason. It was one of the most complex and revolutionary texts ever written in the history of philosophy, and the initial reactions were overwhelmingly negative. Some complained about its difficult style, others claimed the language was incomprehensible, some even compared it to Plato. But there was one particular critique that Kant could simply not tolerate: the comparison of his philosophy to idealism, in particular the popular version by George Berkeley. In his Prolegomena, written 2 years later after the critique, Kant revisits its main ideas in a simplified form. There, he dedicates several pages to distinguishing his philosophy from the Berkeley's. Why did Kant feel the need to distance himself from Berkeley's thought? Because he saw it as a threat to philosophy itself. Reading Berkeley, one cannot help but admire his skills. He first demolishes the philosophical principles that led humans towards skepticism. Then, he constructs a new immaterialist metaphysics. In his Pars Destruens, or Critique of Previous Conceptions, especially Locke's, Berkeley relies solely on reason. He appears to be, since the beginning, a genuine philosopher, not aiming to persuade or deceive. In fact, he often urges the reader to reflect and verify things personally. But following Berkeley's reasoning leads to a troubling conclusion, the same one that worried Kant deeply: the denial of the existence of external matter. Berkeley's arguments seem irrefutable, and yet we all implicitly assume that an external world exists. How can these two possibilities reconcile? Berkeley writes, "In vain do we cast our eyes to the heavens or search the bowels of the earth. We have only to remove the veil of words and behold the bright tree of knowledge, whose fruit is heavenly and within our reach." In his treatise on human knowledge, Berkeley confronts two dominant trends of his time: mechanicism and deism. Mechanism sees reality entirely in mechanical terms, focusing on purely physical and measurable aspects of things. Deism, on the other hand, assumes the existence of a supreme being by reason alone, but rejects revelation, putting it at odds with Catholicism, to which Berkeley belonged. To Berkeley, both tendencies led men toward dangerous skepticism. His treatise, thus, carries an apologetic value. His main target, on which both rationalism and empiricism rely, is the concept of matter. According to him, the root of philosophical error lies not in the obscurity of things, nor in the imperfection of our intellect, but in the false principles we've come to accept. Berkeley writes, "We first raise a dust, then complain we cannot see. It is now time to make a strict inquiry into the first principles of human knowledge." The first major epistemological error, says Berkeley, is the opinion that mind can frame abstract ideas or notions of things. Here Berkeley targets Locke directly. John Locke believed abstraction was a faculty of the intellect, allowing us to isolate a specific quality of an object and treat it as an independent idea. Through abstraction, the mind generalizes, ignoring the peculiarities of an individual thing. But Berkeley finds this process inconceivable. It's impossible, he says, to imagine movement without imagining a moving body with other qualities. The same goes for abstract general ideas. Berkeley reinterprets them from an epistemological level to a linguistic one. A word becomes general not by standing for an abstract general idea, but by being a sign of many particular ideas, each of which it indifferently suggests to the mind. John Locke valued abstraction for expanding knowledge and enabling communication through universal ideas. But Berkeley finds universal ideas contradictory. An idea cannot be all things it represents, and yet no one of them in particular. He writes, universality does not lie in the absolute nature of something, but in its relation to the particular things it represents. So for Berkeley, universals have no ontological foundation, only a linguistic one. So then he begins by attacking abstraction because it implies a substrate, an extended substance independent from the mind. According to Berkeley, the objects of human knowledge are ideas. This may be ideas impressed on the senses, ideas formed from patience or mental operations, or ideas produced by memory or imagination. The essence of ideas is their being perceived, so they exist only insofar as they are perceived. If ideas are perceived, then there must be a perceiver, the spirit. For Berkeley, mind, spirit, and soul all refer to a perceiving activity distinct from ideas. Ideas cannot exist without a mind. On this Berkeley has no doubt. But what about external objects? Here the issue becomes semantic. What do we mean by existence? If we mean existence independent of the mind, then external objects do not exist. But if we mean being perceived, then they do exist. Berkeley writes, their esse is percipi. They cannot exist outside minds or thinking substances that perceive them. It's crucial to see that Berkeley is not promoting nihilism. Later in his responses to objections, he clarifies. He does not deny external reality or what we can grasp of it. Reality is not reduced to a word that exists only in the mind. He writes, there is a rerum natura, and the distinction between reality and chimeras retains its full strength. What Berkeley denies is the existence of matter as a substrate for external reality. To present his critique of materialism, Berkeley returns to what he said about abstraction. As always, he first explains the opposing view. Some distinguish between primary and secondary qualities. They claim our ideas of the former resemble things existing outside the mind, in a substance they call matter. But the concept of matter as a substrate for primary qualities is contradictory. These qualities are ideas that exist only in the mind through perception, so they cannot also exist in a non-thinking substance. Berkeley says there is no point distinguishing primary from secondary qualities, because both exist only in the mind. The idea of a material substrate doesn't explain our perception. It is a useless mental construct. Berkeley reframes the issue semantically. What do we mean when we say support or substrate? Material substance relates to a general concept of being, and the relational concept of supporting accidents. But how can we conceive of something outside the mind, and at the same time not conceive of it? The external substrate would imply primary qualities existing without the mind, which, as Berkeley has shown, is impossible. He gives a concrete example. If I'm in a room with a table, I perceive it through my senses. I have an idea of the table. If I leave the room and think of the table, it still exists, because the idea of the table remains in the memory. I can always reconstruct the idea through imagination, which, however, never goes beyond empirical reality. Moreover, there could always be other minds perceiving or thinking of the table. This is why Berkeley writes, "It does not follow from my principles that bodies are destroyed or created at every moment, or that they don't exist during the intervals between our perceptions." In the 1782 review of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant's transcendental idealism was compared to earlier idealist theories. In the Prolegomena, Kant expressed his frustration. He writes, "That I called my theory transcendental idealism does not entitle anyone to confuse it with the empirical idealism of Descartes or the mystical, fantastical idealism of Berkeley. Kant's transcendental or critical idealism does not question the existence of external reality. Instead, it focuses on how we perceive and represent the reality as phenomena. According to Kant, Berkeley's idealism is dogmatic. Berkeley writes, all knowledge through the senses and experience is mere illusion, and truth lies only in the ideas of pure reason. Kant disagrees. While Berkeley's idea of God serves as his objective criterion for truth, distinguishing real ideas from imaginary ones, Kant finds this approach dogmatic and problematic. Still, Berkeley insists that the regularity of ideas, which we call natural laws, comes from God. We learn the laws of nature from experience, which teaches us that one idea regularly follows another. While the explanation may seem unsatisfying to someone, since it relies on God and not reason, what matters here is how Kant differs. Kant agrees that the external world must exist, otherwise we couldn't know anything at all. What we do know are the phenomena, namely how things appear to us. The noumena, on the other hand, or the things as they are for us impossible to know. To help you understand what he means, think of reality like a coin. We can only ever see one side of the coin, but the other side must exist too, otherwise we wouldn't see anything at all. In a section of Critique of Pure Reason titled Refutation of Idealism, Kant directly challenges idealism. If we follow Berkeley and think of space and time as mental arrangements, space as a relation between ideas and time as a sequence of ideas, then we inevitably fall into dogmatic idealism. To prove the reality of the external world, Kant changes the perspective entirely. He writes, "When I say, in space and time, both the intuition of external objects and the intuition the mind has of itself represent the objects as they affect our senses, that is, as appearances, this does not mean that the objects are mere illusion. Phenomena are real in the sense that they are given to us through our forms of intuition, space and time." Kant then refutes Descartes' problematic idealism too. His proof goes like this: "The mere but empirical determined consciousness of my own existence proves the existence of objects in space outside me. We are aware of ourselves existing in time, but time involves something that persists, and since this permanence cannot be in us, it must be outside us." Kant writes, "Thus, the determination of my existence in time is only possible through the existence of real things that I perceive outside me. Consciousness of my experience is at the same time consciousness of other things existing outside me. So the external world does not exist because we exist. Rather, we exist because an external world exists." This is the foundation of Kant's transcendental idealism. Thank you for watching this video. I'm Ivan and this is Empyreon, the Academy of Philosophy and Fine Arts.